I'm going to demonstrate for you today the self-service capability of Denodo. So what you're seeing here is the interface for the self-service tool. And as you see, this is a browser-based interface. And what this is allowing my users to do is to explore the data catalog that I've created in Denodo. So I'm going to navigate to a database here. I'm going to use the Customer 360 Denodo virtual database. And the first thing I'm going to do is a metadata search. So in the scenario we've created here, I work in the finance department, and one of the application developers has created a web service that takes as an input a customer ID and generates all of the outstanding invoices for that particular customer. The developer has exposed this web service in Denodo, so he's told me that I can now access this web service through a simple SQL view. So I don't recall what the name of the web service was or the view that he created, but in my metadata search field, since I know it's based on a web service, I'm simply going to type in the term web service. And that's going to return two views to me. And the first one is the one I'm interested in. So I look at the view description here. I can see that someone has created a view called customer invoicing that is based on the invoicing data from a web service and is combining that with customer detail information. So this certainly looks like the view that my application developer told me about. So if I go ahead and click on it, the first thing it's going to do is bring me into the view definition. So I can see the descriptions for each of the fields. I can see the field names, and I can see the text. Before I start looking at the actual underlying data, I want to do a little bit more investigating to ensure that this is actually the correct view and that it's actually pulling data from the right sources for my needs. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on the Associations tab. So the associations are a metadata object that we create in Denodo, and you can think of this as a primary key, foreign key type relationship. So these associations can exist between different physical data sources, and even they can exist between sources that don't have a concept of a key. So in this example here, I can see that the invoicing view is tied to customer invoicing, and the customer view is also tied to customer invoicing. And then this is an interactive map, and so if I click on the customer view, I can then see all the other elements that the customer view is tied to. Okay? So based on this initial investigation, it looks like this is promising as far as being the right view. But the one last thing I want to check is the lineage. And so the lineage map is going to give me the full end-to-end picture of all the transformations that were created for this particular view. And on the left-hand side, I have all the columns that are part of this view. And if I click on any of them, for example, company name, it's going to highlight the path that that data went through to get to my final state. And if I click on the highest level icon here, I can see that the company name is highlighted. Okay? And if I trace the underlying path, I can see that at its source, this is coming from a SQL Server database. The user is the Acme user, and this all looks like the right customer CRM database that I'm looking for. Likewise, if I was to click on, for example, full name, that's going to show me the tree view all the way down to the Oracle CRM system in this case. So I can see that the underlying information for customer name is coming from Oracle, and if I look at the top level element here, I can then see exactly what it maps to. So full name from Oracle is mapping to full name in the customer invoice view. And then lastly, the last thing I'm interested in knowing is making sure the invoice data is actually coming from the right place. So if I click over here, if I click over here on the invoice icon, I can see the actual path that it's going to satisfy that invoice. Okay? So this all looks good to me. This looks like it's using the correct data elements. And it's following the correct transformations. So at this point, I want to create a sample query to just kind of take a look at the data. So I'm going to go back over to query, and I know from talking to my developer that I don't want to just do a blind query here because it's going to issue a lot of web service calls. So I'm just going to do a simple query based on a customer ID that I know, C001. And it all looks good. So this is bringing back my detail level data that has all of my customer detail information as well as my invoicing information. So I have my amount due, my description, my package ID, so on and so forth. Now, the reason that I'd asked to have this view put together is that my management has asked me to generate a report that will summarize all of our customers with outstanding invoices and aggregate the total number of invoices as well as the total amount of data that they owe us, or total amount of money that they owe us. So in order to do that, I want to turn this detail level view into an aggregate view. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Advanced, and it's going to bring me into my Advanced Query screen. So the first thing, under Conditions, I can see that I'm still going to query for the same user, and that's okay. And then I'm going to define it as a group by. And so my group by is going to be according to my ID for my customer and my full name. So those will be the two heading columns. And then I'm going to add a couple aggregated fields. The first one is going to be, total invoices. And this is going to be a count function. So as I start typing in count, you can see that it's going to fill in the data for me. So as I start typing in package ID, it automatically fills in package ID for me. So I'm going to select that. And then the other aggregate field I want to create is going to be total dollars. And so this will be a sum of the amount due. Okay? So I've created my aggregate view here. I'm not going to do any order by. I'm just going to go ahead and issue the query. And there it is. So I've now created an aggregate view in the self-service tool. I didn't have to write any SQL. I didn't have to do any transforming. And under the covers, this view is actually combining data from Oracle, SQL Server, as well as a web service call. Okay? So now that I've created this aggregate view, I want to share it with the other people on my team and give them a chance to validate it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Save Query. And I'm just going to call this sample customers with invoices. And I've saved it. And now if I go back out to my starting page, I can see I've got this tab here called Saved Queries, and there it is, Sample Customers with Invoices. So, this is now being saved in my profile. So if I log in, I will see any of the saved queries. But what I can also do at this point is I can share it. So at this point, I now have a URL that's been created here, and I can just simply email this URL around to people on my team so that they can go ahead and take a look at this particular custom query that I've created. So I send it over. Now, it pops up with the name and the description of the view, and I say load. And so now anybody on my team would be automatically taken to this same query interface and have the ability to interrogate what I just created. Okay? And then the last thing, if we decide that this is something that we actually want to publish to the wider world, I then have the ability to deploy the query. So if I click on deploy, I can now deploy this query to my Denodo repository, and now that query would be accessible to everybody through every interface that has access to Denodo. Okay? So the next scenario that I wanted to touch on with the self-service tool is, what if you don't know any of the underlying metadata structures? So in our initial example, I did a metadata search for web service because the developer told me that the view he created was based on a web service. So I was able to search based on a metadata tag. However, it's quite possible that you may not know any of the underlying table names or view names or anything like that, but you actually know what some of the data elements are. So Denodo also has this concept of doing a data search directly in the self-service tool. Now, what's unique about this is that the search itself is not going against the underlying data. So Denodo has the ability to leverage Lucene indexes or Elasticsearch indexes, which are analogous to creating like a Google search on your underlying data. So you choose the Denodo views and columns that you want to index, and then your users can come into this search dialog and simply type in, say, the word Smith, and that search is going to go against the underlying index and return to me all the results that have the word Smith in it, as well as the view that contains that value, okay? So if I go ahead and click on Load View, it's now going to bring me into all the individual rows that are tagged with, that have the name Smith in it. And if I click on Live Data, at this point, it's actually going to do a live query against the underlying data. So here we see this is Kimberly Smith, this is her ID, this is her social security number, and I also down here have a number of linkages. So remember early I mentioned that we had this concept of associations. Well, you saw that we had associations between customer and invoice, and since Denodo knows that there's a relationship between those two views, anytime you issue a query against a view that has an association, it's going to give you the option to automatically drill into an associated view. So if I click on this link here, what it's going to do is then go out and run a query against the invoicing view for that client ID. So if I go ahead and click Invoices, there they are. So client ID 525, and here's all the detail level information on their invoice. And if I want to drill down even further, I can get down to the individual product for a given invoice. And none of that had to be coded. All we did in Denodo was define that there was a relationship between two columns and two views of Denodo. Okay? So far we've showed you a little bit of data exploration, data subsetting, the ability to save a new view of the data. And the last phase of leveraging Denodo is the publishing phase. So as I mentioned early on, there's a number of different ways that you can access the data. We just walked through a number of examples here using the self-service tool, but probably the most common way people want to access their data would be through some sort of SQL interface or BI tool. And so over here I have MicroStrategy Desktop. You can see I'm connected to my Denodo database as the admin user, or Denodo repository, excuse me, and I've chosen the Customer 360 database. And I'm just going to go ahead and pick that same customer view that I was working with in the self-service tool and drag it onto my report. I'm going to go ahead and issue a SQL statement, and there it is. So all the same data that we just saw in the self-service tool you can get at through the BI tool, through any of the BI tools that talk JDBC or ODBC or frankly any major BI tool out there. Okay? Now for your more advanced users, you may want to give them access to the admin tool itself. So this is the admin tool where you would actually create new views. And so the first screen I want to point out here is our VQL shell. And this is going to be familiar to anybody that uses SQL Workbench or SQL Plus or any command line tool that they're used to writing SQL. They can just come in here and write ANSI standard SQL to access any of that data. So here we're going to go against that customer invoicing view that we showed you early on. Go ahead and execute it, and there it is. So the same results that we saw as part of the self-service flow, we can get at through the tool itself. Now, creating these views is also extremely simple. So over here under example, I have the customer view that we've been working with and the invoice view. So at this point, to create that customer invoicing view that we've been working with, it simply is right mouse click on customer, new join. I would then drag the invoice onto the palette. I would join ID to client ID since I know that's where the join exists. I click execute, and there I have it. So from scratch, you just saw me create that customer invoicing view and issue the same query for a client C001 and get the exact same result set. So you can see that the speed to create new objects and the ease of creating customized versions of things is extremely powerful. Now, the last thing I wanted to show you as far as access goes is Denodo is very strong in exposing our data through APIs. So over here, I've created a RESTful API. If I double click on that, I can see that the RESTful API is actually made up of these 6 different views. Okay, so customer, invoice, and a number of other ones that that are part of my repository. So I've already saved it and deployed it, so I'm just going to go ahead and run it, and there it is. So I've got a hyperlink next to any of the views that were part of that link, and if I click on customer, you can see now that those hyperlinks that were in the self-service tool are now showing up in my RESTful API. So the same scenario where I start out by looking for a customer, and then I want to drill into that customer's invoices, I simply just have to click on Has Invoices on this web page, and there it is. So this represents all the invoices for that customer, and then if I want to get down to a lower level detail, I click on Product Details, and it gives me the individual product that makes up that invoice. And then lastly, we talked about how we can ingest any type of data, we can talk any sort of underlying language, but we can also expose this data very easily in whatever format your end users require. So the REST API will default to using HTML because it's a very readable interface. But if we'd like, it's also very simple to change that format to something like JSON. And all I had to do was add the tag to the end of the URL and change the format. And likewise, if I'd like it to be an XML format, I simply change the tag to be XML.